start-up of the Mosquito, which is our first item on the airfield, but I thought you might like the latest info on the schedule before the Mozzie gets underway. So, Mosquito taxi run to begin with. Then we've got the Spitfire 5 from Fighter Aviation Engineering. That'll be followed by the first Lancaster taxi run of the day. Then we've got some formation aerobatics from the two Yakovlev Yak 52s of the Flying Comrades. The always very welcome sight of B-17G Flying Fortress. Sally B will be following that up at about 1:45. Then we've got the Sci Marchetti SF-260, the Aircraft Restoration Company's Westland Lyso NF2. Very much his life's work. The sole currently active Mosquito in the UK or Europe. Former Battle of Britain Memorial Flight Bomber pilot Mike Chatterton at the helm of HJ711 as it gets underway to open the East Kirkby Airshow 2026. Tony Agar reckons that parts from somewhere in the region of 50 different Mosquitoes have contributed towards the restoration that produced this one. And as a reminder of that fact, shavings from many of those donor airframes are kept in the cartridge containers in the cockpit, so as many as possible of them have a tangible presence. Chesterton at the helm of Tony Agar's Mosquito. And so, look out to the right, our first flying display of the day, the Fighter Aviation Engineering Supermarine Spitfire LF-5C. This time it was Ernie Taylor and engineer Jody Ilcock at the helm of the Lancaster. It was designed for the Soviet paramilitary flying training organization called DOSAF, but of course with the end of the Cold War and the falling of the metaphorical Iron Curtain, this is an aeroplane that achieved an outstanding amount of success in terms of sales in the West. There we've seen the formation change from echelon into line astern for a barrel roll. And they're back into echelon. I said this is a workmanlike looking aircraft. It is an extremely rugged aeroplane, as all Soviet and Russian aircraft had to be to operate in some of the extreme weather that they would experience over there. The accent very much on simplicity of design and operation, and so it is with this aircraft. Plenty of power, 360 horsepower from the big Vedenev radial engine up front, which equips all sorts of light and sporting and utility aircraft built in the former Soviet Union. You might have noticed when the aircraft flew in towards you that the main wheels don't actually retract fully. Far cheaper to operate than something like, say, a Harvard, one of which we'll be seeing later. Now, in directly towards us for a break. Here, the two-seater with a tricycle undercarriage, but they also built Yak 52s equipped with tail wheels. Some of them also with uprated engines. The team leader's aircraft now giving us a solo aerobatic slot, aerobatic competition category, solely for the Yak 52. on display centre as the two aircraft prepare to rejoin shortly for the final few manoeuvres of the display. The team leader today is Phil Hardesty, now in his 7th year of display flying. He started out in the display team of de Havilland Chipmunks, known as the Red Sparrows. He's a commercial pilot who's been flying one way or another since he was just 10 years old, and he is a very regular sight on the display circuit. Also flying as part of the GI flight of Piper L4s and the American Mark Tiger Moth that we saw landing in earlier on. And joining him, another commercial pilot, Alex Newton, as the number 2 here, following Phil round in this liner stern pass. Alex first got to know Phil when he was on the same course at the Oxford Air Training School. He got his private pilot's licence aged just 17 and began flying the Ac-52 in 2007. He's now in his 5th year on the display circuit. And so coming in for their final manoeuvre, their last break of a typically professional display from these two now very seasoned display pilots. In they come towards us, the two Yak 52s, Phil Hardesty and Alex Newton, the Flying Comrades. Looking out onto the horizon over towards the right, it's always a pleasure to see not only a 4-engine bomber right in front of us on the grass here at East Kirkby, but also to have one in the air. And that's what we're going to enjoy now, courtesy of an aeroplane that represents one of the greatest achievements in the history of aircraft preservation in this country. A 4-engine bomber kept airworthy in solely private hands. And here it is, running in from the right, the Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress, named Sally B.
Sally B.
Those daylight raids were still an incredibly perilous business. The 8th Air Force was primarily conducting those daylight raids against German industrial targets and transport and resupply networks, for example, railway marshalling yards and rail junctions. The dangers for the crews engaged in the daylight raids over Europe was immense. With one of the KC-135s of today's bloody 100th. Now you can see bomb doors open on this path, showing you just how small the B-17's bomb bay is in comparison with, say, that of the Lancaster. Sally B has now been on the display circuit in Britain and performing commemorative flights since it arrived on these shores in private ownership in 1975. It's an incredible record. Without Ellie, it's certain that this aircraft would no longer be acting as the great flying memorial it is to the men of the 8th Air Force in particular, who flew from East Anglia during wartime. French government's IGN, Institut Géographique National, mapping organisation on mapping and survey flights around the world, disposed by them in the 1970s, and it was in 1975 that the aeroplane embarked on its new life in the UK, and here it stayed ever since. A really distinctive feature of the SF-260 are the wingtip mounted fuel tanks, and they've got little winglets on them which direct air onto the outer edge of the ailerons on the wings, and they help maintain good roll authority even when the aircraft is in the stall, and the pilot gets excellent feedback as it approaches the stall. When that moment occurs, its characteristics are apparently very benign indeed. And the wing waggle on the final pass there for the SF-260. And a lovely demonstration there of the short takeoff capabilities which were part of the Lysander's raison d'etre. Two units of these aircraft, numbers 138 and 161 squadrons, supported the wartime SOE and conducted the Lysander's most famous wartime missions. In fact, between them, those two squadrons completed in excess of 400 operations from August 1941 to the end of 1944. Sites that would be lit by nothing more than moonlight, perhaps a few torches which would hopefully be put there to mark the strip by members of the French resistance. And the pilots of these aircraft committed many heroic deeds in sometimes incredibly challenging conditions. And these were long flights, as much as 8 to 9 hours, depending on their eventual destination. And of course they'd be flown with the aircraft heavily laden and little idea for the crew of what might transpire on their arrival in France. One pilot of number 161 Squadron, Peter Vaughan Fowler, found one landing site lit by candles and burning newspapers due to a lack of torches. The Operation Crossbow campaign against the German V weapons. The weather was dreadful. At one stage, to keep below cloud, he descended just 500 feet over the channel. They took 15 years to conduct this meticulous restoration. It was completed in the summer of 2018, and it flew again for the first time in at least 72 years that August, finished in its original number 225 Squadron colours from 1941. The Aircraft Restoration Company has done a lot of research into the crews who flew this very aeroplane during wartime. And it's shown that one of its pilots went on to receive the Air Force Cross and a posthumous Distinguished Flying Cross. Another was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross. One of the gunners who flew on this aircraft in wartime moved on to serve on number 617 Squadron, the Dambusters, and flew on the Ruhr Dams raid in May 1943 as a tail gunner. And a gentle wing rock on departure from Mike Collett, head of training now at the Aircraft Restoration Company. He's heading off back to his base at Duxford. He's got a Spitfire to fly later today. The SIS needed an aircraft of its own, and this very one provided that. It's the first production prototype example of the Lockheed 12A. It was sold second-hand to the Secret Intelligence Service in early 1939, shipped to Britain, and converted for the reconnaissance role by the Cunliffe Owing Company at Eastleigh in Southampton and Airwork at Heston. It went on to be flown operationally by Sidney Cotton himself, but also by his co-pilot, Flying Officer Bob Niven, a Canadian. Thankfully, unlike Cotton's, Niven's logbooks survived, and they reveal some of this aircraft's secret missions. They also reveal what it didn't do, and what has perhaps passed into legend. It started out photographing key points in the Italian Empire, as far afield as Italian Somaliland and Libya, naval bases, aerodromes, and the like. And then, in mid-August 1939, it made its first sortie over Germany. That sortie started and finished at Heston, near London. It lasted 6 hours 10 minutes. It captured Luftwaffe airfields and the East Frisian Islands. Later that month, it photographed naval objectives in the North German coastal areas. It also flew several times to the famous Tempelhof Airport in the centre of Berlin on business associated with Cotton's SIS cover story, which was as a representative of a company making colour photographic film. But records show it never actually undertook any photography on those sorties to Berlin. When war broke out, obviously it could no longer fly over the Reich. It carried out missions to the west coast of Ireland to check reports of German U-boats refuelling there, and it flew to the Dutch and Belgian ports to check on the presence or otherwise of boom defences. But eventually it returned to Britain, being sold to Fighter Aviation Engineering and restored by Air Leasing at Sywell. The utterly gorgeous and incredibly historically significant Lockheed 12A Electra Junior, flown today by Ben Cox and Steve Jones. In some ways, so many great display pilots, including some that we see flying, for example, heavy warbirds on the airshow circuit these days, cut their teeth on the turbulent team. It's a brilliant training ground for the aspiring display pilot. You get to learn, as I say, some interesting handling characteristics. You get to learn about being on the display circuit, travelling around between venues. You get to practice your formation flying skills, and all of this for a relatively low cost. So much of this is the raison d'etre of the Tiger Club, established nearly 17 years ago and still going very strong, today based at Damins Hall in Essex. They operate, as the name suggests, Tiger Moths. They've got a Cat 10 that we were hoping to see in the show today, and they've got the Turbs as their flagships. Here running in box formation to start their display, and they'll be going into a 360-degree turn. And maintaining such a stable, close formation is made all the more challenging by being in such a low-powered aircraft as this, because if you get out of formation, the likelihood is that you simply haven't got the power at your disposal to be able to regain. So this is very, very impressive formation flying indeed. As they finish their circle, and we see a very smartly executed formation change coming up.
Softly, what do you get?
In for another circle on display centre. The team being led today by Alex Renier, who joined the Tiger Club in 2017. His aim to expand his experience on tailwheel equipped aircraft, and that he's certainly done.
Yeah.
And you really get an idea of how bumpy it is up at the altitude they're flying from how these tiny little aeroplanes are being bucked about in the breeze. And now the 3 aircraft left in the main formation, running in for a break. And you can see some of those ground crew now hard at work out in front of us on the airfield as they do so. And Alex will shortly call the break. You might be able to make out the fact that he indicates exactly when to execute the brake using. Watch the limbo pole holders as well, holding the washing line absolutely rock steady out there, even when the little turbs are hammering towards them. Of these turbulents were built by Rollisons at Croydon, and the Tiger Club has had about 18 of them over the years. The first one came to Britain 70 years ago this year. That's the Silver aircraft taking part in the formation today. Roger Drouin was the man behind this design. Positioning themselves out in the centre of the airfield because we're getting ready to deliver some high explosive ordnance. They're getting their eye in. Here comes the second. Oh, too late a release. And now for number 3. I have never seen the target actually being taken out, and I still haven't. There's a final go. Oh, well, it didn't actually hit the target, but we will call that a hit. And again, the yellow and white aircraft has a choice of 2. Air shows across Europe. I saw them earlier this year in France. The crowd absolutely loved them like no other act in the show. The red one going high, and yes, it worked. Silver aircraft going well underneath the first balloon. There's 3 up there now, heading for the second, and yes, it's successful. A unique act, if ever there was one, in the very best of airshow traditions, coming past you for the last time. They'll be waving at you, wave back at them, and there they go. I say Nordine rather than North American, this of course being a North American design because this is one of the many Harvards that were built in Canada, either by the Nordine company or by Canadian Car and Foundry. And this yellow Harvard that we're watching has an incredible history to its name. It dates from 1944. It served initially with the RAF, then in 1947 it went to the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down in Wiltshire, that famous flight test and trials organisation, and it stayed there with its successor organisation, Latterly, and of course now Kinetic, until late 2016. British military charge. It was then sold to the Aircraft Restoration Company at Duxford, and then in 2022 it went to the Rolls-Royce Heritage Flight. And it's an aircraft that has carried on being used in exactly the role it was intended for. And it's absolutely incredible that it survived, because in June 1991, thankfully the aircraft managed to free itself from the errant parachute. Otherwise, we wouldn't be seeing it flying here today. The harbour, just like this one, still a crucial part of our historic aircraft scene today. Nearly 15,500 harbours, or as they were known to the US Army Air Forces, the T-6 and AT-6 Texan, as they were known to the US Navy and Marines, the SNJ, were built. Absolutely brilliant trainer, powerful, with a 600 horsepower Pratt & Whitney Wasp radial engine, some handling characteristics similar to the fighters the trainees would hopefully move on to. To begin with, the Twin Star used German-built diesel power plants from a company called Thiele, based on Mercedes car engine blocks. And this one, which was built in 2007, has the Thiele engines. And pretty much right from the start, this aircraft was showing some pretty impressive capabilities. Coming in now with the undercarriage down. The most impressive demonstration of that was in 2004, shortly after the aircraft received its European certification, when the late test pilot Gérard Guillemot used a DA-42 to make the first ever non-stop transatlantic crossing by a diesel-engined fixed-wing aircraft. The programme suffered a bit of a setback in 2008 when its engine maker Thiele went bust and production was suspended. But Diamond set up a subsidiary company, Austro Engines, to produce its own AE300 diesel engine, which they now call the A4, and the DA42NG for whether it's new or next generation, was the result. More powerful than the previous aircraft, and sales resumed with a vengeance. And Twin Stars are used for training either by or on behalf of many major airlines. For example, Air India and Lufthansa have their own fleets of these aeroplanes, and by a lot of commercial pilot training companies. Known by a Chinese firm, Wanfeng Aviation, but they still build the Twin Star both at their traditional plant at Wiener Neustadt in Austria and in London, Ontario. The added safety margin of having twin engines. It's a lot cheaper than the turboprop aircraft would be. What's more, it can be fueled with either diesel or jet fuel. Horsepower on the Jacobs engine 17L model to a one-off with a 710 horsepower Wright engine with supercharging, which was used for air racing. But even the relatively standard Stagger wings showed the sort of performance that really surprised even for an executive aircraft of the day. On air races and long distance flights, they managed to execute some very notable exploits, different versions, won the very prestigious Texaco and Bendix Trophy air races in the States in the 1930s. Jacqueline Cochran set a new women's outright world air speed record in a modified Stagger wing. When war came around, this aircraft type had all sorts of roles, particularly as a VIP transport, for example, for diplomats, and as a communications aircraft. The US Army Air Forces and Navy and the RAF used them in quantity. Before war broke out, a quite early Stagger wing was used by the same Secret Intelligence Service reconnaissance flight led by Sidney Cotton as the Lockheed 12 we saw earlier. You're wondering why it makes the sound it does. Well, it's down to the exhausts. The left-hand 4 cylinders are on one exhaust pipe, the right-hand 4 cylinders on another, and the bottom cylinder is on a third exhaust pipe. Every second rotation, you hear the puff of that one cylinder with its short exhaust stack. Painted as the personal aeroplane of His Royal Highness Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands while he was in exile in London from 1941 to 45 while his country was occupied, and that's why it has a rather unusual serial number, PB1, Prince Bernhard 1. The real PB1 was destroyed during a Luftwaffe raid on Ever airfield near Brussels on New Year's Day 1945. This aircraft was sold to its current owner, Peter Kuipers, in 2020. Peter, as a Dutchman, decided to keep it in the Prince Bernhard colour scheme. famous operator of the Chipmunk in the RAF for a purpose other than training was the station flight at RAF Gatow in West Berlin during the Cold War. From 1956 onwards, it flew Chipmunks on photo reconnaissance and occasionally even electronic intelligence gathering duties on behalf of BRICS, the British Commanders-in-Chief mission to the Soviet forces in Germany, as it was rather euphemistically named. Flying over divided Berlin, exploiting Allied rights to fly within the Berlin control. They used those rights to both observe and photograph Soviet installations inside the Berlin zone and around its periphery, obtaining very many notable intelligence coups along the way, and on at least one occasion being shot at from the ground by Soviet troops. One of the two Chipmunks on the Battle of Britain Memorial flight strength is indeed a former Cold War Berlin Chipmunk. Nations other than Canada and the UK have flown the Chipmunk. They were flown on skis in Denmark, and they were also built under license in Portugal. In spite of being conceived as a trainer, Yak 11s did see combat. In fact, one of them, operated by the North Korean Air Arm, was among the first victims of an aerial shoot-down in the Korean War. On the 27th of June 1950, 2 days after that war started, North American F-82G twin Mustangs of the 68th Fighter All-Weather Squadron of the US Air Force were providing air cover. In 2013, it was bought by its current owner, Andrew Holman West, who's the founder and boss of a company called Russian Radials, based at Atherstone near Stratford-on-Avon, which specialises, as the name suggests, in the overhaul, the maintenance and the rebuild of Soviet-era radial power plants, like the ones we saw in the Yak 52s earlier, and like the one in this Yak 11. And it's made some quite notable appearances, this aircraft. Andrew flew it to Belbek in the Crimea for an air show in 2013. You certainly couldn't do that now, with various other members of the Royal Air Squadron. And he's got quite a fleet of aeroplanes at his private strip at Alscott Park, the former RAF Atherstone, including a Yak 3, he's got a Yak 50, a Yak 52, and a Beech 18. wave on departure there from Sam Watmo at the controls of Andrew Holman West's Yak C11. Ready to get the Mosquito and the Lancaster out for their final flourish of the day. As ever, the tremendously hard-working team of engineers getting the two aircraft ready for you, and we begin with the start-up of the Lancaster. only at East Kirkby, the closing act of our 2026 air show. The Merlins on the Lancaster and the Mosquito fall silent, and we finish off another memorable and really varied and enjoyable day's flying and taxiing activity at this wonderful